All right, hello everyone. These are the notes for Target 6A. So make sure you are writing things down. The three things that you really need to write down are the three main vocabulary words for this unit, and then after that, most of it is just practice. So thankfully, this unit is pretty easy. So for this target, we have our learning target. This is what I want to see you be able to do by the end of this unit. It is to evaluate evidence to create a logical argument that changes in environmental conditions may result in the change, development, or extinction of a species over time. So we're going to break down what it means for a species to change, develop, and go extinct. So these are the three important vocab terms to know. So essentially for this unit, you're going to get a scenario and you're going to have to tell me, do the animals or plants or whatever organism in that scenario, do they change, do they develop, or do they go extinct? So if you don't know what those words mean, you're not going to be able to answer the question. So make sure that you have this written down somewhere so you can refer back to it. So, and I apologize, we changed the wording for this because our standards changed a little bit, but instead of saying change, we're going to say increase, which makes a little bit more sense because when animals increase, it's when the species of animals obtains an adaptation allowing organisms to survive and reproduce. So anything that's going to allow the numbers of those animals or those organisms to go up, to increase, is going to be increasing. It's going to be an adaptation. The next one is to develop. So this is when a species changes into a new species, and we'll look at what that looks like here in just a second. But when we have one species and it either gets split off or the whole entire group changes into a different species. And then the last one is pretty easy, straightforward. Extinction is when all of the members of a species die out or go extinct. I like to think of Ice Age when I think of this one. If you've seen those movies, the big issue in Ice Age is that they're going extinct because of the Ice Age, so they have to kind of all move. So they're all dying out. That's going extinct. All right, so now we're going to watch a video about what a species is, because in order to be able to tell if the species is going to increase, develop, or go extinct, we have to know what it means to be a species.
The average person on the street can probably tell you that cats and dogs are different species, and chances are they can come up with some reasons why. Cats and dogs look different. They behave differently. They don't make kitten-puppy hybrids. Same goes for squirrels and raccoons. We know intuitively that they're different species. But what about these squirrels? Or these trees? Well, it turns out the squirrels are different species, and the trees are the same species. But how do we know that? And what is a species anyway? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask a biologist, they might tell you that species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Some would add the idea of potential to reproduce. For example, if two groups are separated by a barrier, but they could reproduce if they got together, then they're still the same species. An ecologist might give you a different definition. A species is a set of organisms adapted to a particular set of resources in the environment. Some might add that species have different physical characteristics or morphologies. Between these two concepts, we get something that's pretty broadly accepted across most of science. Sounds good, right? But in nature, things can get pretty fuzzy. For one, how meaningful is it that two groups have the potential to interbreed if they never meet in nature? Elk live in North America, and red deer live in Eurasia. In captivity, they can produce fertile offspring, but they could not possibly meet in nature. Stickleback fish live in isolated groups all across the northern hemisphere. Some groups look different, and they don't meet in nature, but they can reproduce in an aquarium tank. Second, some groups that everyone agrees are different species can interbreed. Take the polar bear and the grizzly bear. They look different, they live in different habitats, they eat different foods. DNA evidence suggests these two groups have been reproducing separately for hundreds of thousands of years. Clearly a different species, right? But they can and do produce hybrid offspring in nature. By the way, this is not unusual. Coyotes and gray wolves are different species, but they have interbred. Coyotes on the east coast of North America have a significant amount of DNA not only from wolves, but also from dogs. There are many more examples of hybridization between species. If two groups look alike, we have to work really hard to even know if they have interbred or not. Beyond all of these challenges, this species concept only fits with some types of living things, mainly plants and animals. Lots of living things, including bacteria, reproduce without a partner, so this whole interbreeding metric doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for defining fossil species either. They can't reproduce at all. Species of bacteria and fossils are usually defined by how different they are, measures that can be pretty arbitrary. Bacteria species are defined by differences in their DNA sequences. Fossil species are defined by differences in their anatomy, their age, and where they were found. Scientists in other fields use entirely different definitions. All of this is to say that the best way to define a species depends on what you're studying and what you're trying to do. There is no universal definition. To take a page out of the book of the philosophers, it's actually helpful to stop looking at species as things, and instead look at speciation as a process that generates transient things. Species aren't fixed entities, they change. Evidence from fossils tells us that species that lived in the past were different than the ones that are alive today. Add to this evidence from DNA, anatomy, and embryos, and we know that living things change over time. The world we live in today is just a snapshot in a long evolutionary timeline. Looking from this perspective, we can see that there is not one moment in time where an old species becomes a new, different species, and there's not a moment in time where one species becomes two. In our snapshot of today, some groups are clearly different species. Many others are in the process of speciation, and some groups are even in the process of coming back together. Just as they have in the past, these processes will continue into the future. Some of the boundaries are fuzzy, and that's okay. All of this may leave you wondering, why do we even use the word species at all? Well, there are a lot of reasons why this species concept is important. One is conservation. If we hope to protect a group from habitat destruction or potential extinction, we need to be able to define the group we're trying to protect. Another is that this concept of species helps us and the scientific community to categorize and communicate about groups of living things. When scientists study speciation as a process that is driven by natural selection, they gain insights into some of the biggest issues faced by humankind, like antibiotic resistance, world hunger, and cancer. Instead of getting too caught up in what a species is, you may be better served to focus on the context in which the term is being used. Different contexts call for different definitions.
Alright, so that was kind of a long video. But we're going to define more of what a species is in biology, and while we're talking about these three terms that we need to know and what it means for us to talk about a species changing, developing, and going extinct. Okay, so in biology and for this target, this is typically how we define a species when we're talking about if they're going to increase in number, if they're going to change into a different species, or if they're going to go extinct. The biggest reason we need to know what a species is and define a species is because of that develop vocab term. So if one species is changing into another, how do we tell that it's changed into a new species? So when we define a species, we say that it's typically a group of organisms that are able to breed and have fertile offspring. So if they're able to breed, typically that means that they're going to be in the same location, because like that video said, even though some animals can breed together, they might not live in the same location. So if an animal lives in Iowa and a different animal lives in Brazil, they might be able to breed, but realistically in nature they're never going to actually be able to interact, so we would still count them as separate species. So that's what we're kind of looking at when we're trying to figure out, have animals developed into a new species? Are they still able to interbreed? Do they still live in the same area? Do they still have a lot of the same diets and mating behaviors? If not, it's probably changed into a different species. Okay, so we're going to do 3 practice scenarios so that you can kind of start to understand a little bit more how to use these vocab terms, and then you'll have to do some practice scenarios on your own, and then you'll take the test. So like I said, it's a pretty simple target. If you understand the vocab and you can apply it to different situations, you'll be good to go. So for this, I want to know, are the animals in this scenario increasing, so the numbers are going up because of an adaptation? Are they developing into a different species, or are they going extinct and all of the members of that species are dying out? So Whales have forelimbs that have been modified into flippers that allow them to steer themselves through the water to better catch prey. Is this an example of a species increasing, developing, or going extinct? So I would pause the video here, try and answer this question on your own, and then I will give you the answer here in just a second. So for this one, we would say that the whales here in this scenario are increasing because the flippers are giving them an adaptation that would allow them to catch more prey. So because they can catch more prey, they're going to be able to survive and reproduce, increasing their numbers. So this scenario would be increasing. Let's take a look at a different scenario. Again, we're trying to figure out, are the animals in this scenario going to be increasing, developing, or going extinct? Whaling is the process where whales are killed off for luxury meals, so food, to decrease competition for fish and to use as bait to catch fish. So lots of different reasons why humans are poaching whales. This has caused the population of whale numbers to decrease significantly over the past 100 years. Is this an example of a species increasing, developing, or going extinct? So again, pause the video, try and figure it out on your own. When you do these practice scenarios and when you do your test, you can't just tell me one of the vocab terms. So you can't just tell me, oh, it's going to increase, or oh, it's going to develop. You have to tell me why you were thinking that. So for this one, it would go extinct. So this is a really good example of a good response. So extinct, we know this because if poaching the whales continues, then the numbers will decrease and could potentially cause all of the whales in the species to die off. So that's my reasoning for it. The numbers of whales are going to die off if people keep killing them. And our last practice scenario. Again, are the animals in this scenario going to increase, develop, or go extinct? A species of chipmunks was separated when the Grand Canyon was formed. One lives in one side of the canyon and the other members live on the opposite side. Over the years, the squirrels encountered changes in their mating behavior, color, and diet. Is this an example of a species increasing, developing, or going extinct? So this one is going to be develop. So develop, I think, is the trickiest one because you have to kind of determine, is the species changed enough to be considered a new species? A good way to do that is to rule out the other ones. So nothing in this paragraph talks about how the squirrels are dying off, so it's probably not going to be extinct, because if it was extinct, all the members of the chipmunks, all the members of the chipmunks would have to die off. It's not going to be increased because we're not really talking about any sort of like adaptation or anything that would help the chipmunks to survive better. We're just talking about how one group of chipmunks has changed. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing better than the other group. It just means that they've changed their mating behavior and they've changed the things that they eat because they've had to, because of the separation from the other group of chipmunks. So because the chipmunks' mating behavior has changed, it means that they most likely wouldn't be able to mate with the other group of chipmunks. This means that they would be considered separate species. So again, the biggest thing we're looking for is, can they still mate, or have there been too many changes that would cause them to be separate species? Or are they just in different locations? If one group is on one side of the Grand Canyon, which is kind of like a mountain, but not really if you don't know what a canyon is. But if one group is on one side and another group is on a different side, squirrel or chipmunks can't fly, so they can't get across this big divide that would separate them. So even if they could still mate together, they're going to be considered a different species because they can no longer interact with each other. All right, so let's talk about next steps. So you are going to take the 6A practice scenarios to check your work using the 6A key, because again, if you get all of those correct, then you know you're going to get 100% on the test, because really the test is just making the same type of stuff. You are reading through a scenario and you're telling me, do you think the animals are going to increase, develop, or go extinct?